You lost something important and decided it was the end. But what if that very loss was the only way to take you where you didn't dare to go? There is a moment that is familiar to almost everyone. Something breaks. A job, a relationship, a plan that you pinned everything on. And the first thought is the same. I have failed. The brain instantly delivers a verdict, and you begin to live within that verdict, without even checking if it is fair. But some losses work differently. Not as a defeat, but as a correction. Not as an end, but as an answer to a question you've been asking, not knowing how it should sound. The problem is that in the moment of loss, it's impossible to see this because pain occupies the entire field of vision. By the end of this video, it will become clearer why the brain automatically reads loss as failure and where exactly this mechanism deceives you. We live in a culture where loss is almost always seen as a mistake. Lost a job? Didn't try hard enough. Lost a relationship? Did something wrong. Lost direction? It means weakness. This logic is so ingrained that we apply it automatically even before we have had a chance to reflect. But the brain has a specific reason for reacting this way. It is geared towards preserving the familiar because the familiar feels safe. Any disruption, any break from what was, registers as a threat, not as information, not as a signal, precisely as a threat. And in this mode, the subtle distinctions between loss as an end and loss as a turn simply do not register. That is why the following often happens. A person loses something they have long wanted to leave, but could not allow themselves that choice. And still, for the first weeks, sometimes months, they experience it as a catastrophe. Not because the situation is objectively bad, but because the brain has already rendered its verdict. It is here that the gap arises between what is actually happening and how we interpret it. Loss can simultaneously be painful and liberating. It can be the end of something and the beginning of what you vaguely sensed but were afraid to want. These two facts do not contradict each other, but the brain in threat mode does not allow holding both. Then arises a question that is worth asking yourself honestly. What if some of the things you lost were precisely what was holding you back? There is a persistent belief that the intensity of pain from loss directly reflects its significance. The more painful it is, the worse the event that occurred. The harder it is to let go, the clearer it is that it was a mistake, tragedy, failure. But this belief confuses the intensity of the experience with the quality of the event. Pain is a signal of change, not an assessment of whether the change was needed. Think about this. A person clings to a job for years, which exhausts them to the point that it becomes difficult to get up on Sunday mornings. They don't leave because of stability, mortgage. What if it gets worse? Inside, something has long signaled fatigue, but they divert their attention and continue. And then, a layoff, restructuring, the end of a contract. The first reaction is disaster. Several weeks of anxiety, a feeling of being discarded. But then, after a while, they notice that for the first time in years, they wake up without that background tension in their shoulders, which they had gotten so used to they no longer felt it. Loss did what they themselves did not have the courage to do. Here it's important to stop at a mechanism that remains invisible. People often send requests for change, but not direct, not conscious ones. It's not a prayer with a clearly formulated desire. It's the accumulated fatigue from what is, the irritation that arises every time when it's necessary to go where one does not want to. A dream that a person hides behind the words, "Well, that's unrealistic." Avoidance that builds up over months. All of this is a signal of what one truly wants, but they are not articulated as a decision. And that's why the response to them, when it comes from the outside, through loss, through rupture, through forced change, is perceived as a blow, not as an answer. The brain does not connect these 2 points. It does not say, "You wanted to leave for a long time, and here's your way out." It says, "You were thrown out," and immediately triggers a threat response. That's why a person can experience as a loss that from which they deeply wanted to free themselves. This is not a contradiction or a weakness. This is just how interpretation works in moments of stress. It cuts off context and sees only the fact of the rupture. But there is another scenario, and it is even harder to understand in the moment. Sometimes you lose not what you wanted to leave, but what you genuinely loved and wanted to preserve. Relationships that seemed right, a project into which you invested yourself, a direction you considered yours. And this goes away not because you were indifferent, but despite the fact that you tried. Such losses are the hardest to reconcile with any idea of meaning or benefit. However, another layer operates here as well. Sometimes what we hold on to with maximum effort occupies space that is needed for something that we cannot yet see. A person who clings to relationships that have long ceased to be alive spends resources not only on those relationships, they spend it on maintaining a version of themselves that exists within them. When this ends, there is a feeling of emptiness at first, and then, sometimes after months, you notice that you were doing things you once abandoned. You talk differently. You want things that once seemed incompatible with your life. The internal monologue in such moments often sounds like this: I would never choose this myself. And that's true. This is precisely why it happened differently. Some changes a person does not make consciously because the cost seems too high, or because they do not see where exactly they need to move. Loss sometimes removes this question of choice, and it is not a disaster, although it feels like one. The most difficult question here is not, why did this happen, but another, how to distinguish a loss that truly opens up something new from one that simply causes pain without any direction. Is there even such a criterion? Or is it just a retrospective story we tell ourselves later to avoid feeling like victims of circumstance? The question that ended the previous part was this: is there a criterion by which one can distinguish a loss that opens a path from one that simply causes pain? Yes, and it is simpler than it seems. One must look not at the loss itself, but at what had been accumulating before it. If something had been building up inside before the loss, irritation, fatigue, avoidance, a feeling of incongruity, then the loss was likely a response to that accumulated signal. If there was nothing like that, it's a different situation, and it should not be forcibly transformed into a lesson. Right now, without delay, take one specific loss that still feels like a sentence. Not one that happened yesterday, but one that your thoughts keep returning to. And ask yourself one question: what did I notice inside myself in the months leading up to this? Not what was wrong with the situation, but rather what was happening within you. Fatigue from certain conversations, a desire that you postponed, a feeling that something is off, but changing is frightening. Write it down in one phrase, not as a detailed text, just one observation. This does not work as therapy or as a way to comfort oneself. This is diagnosis. You check whether the loss had an internal context that you had not associated with it before. If a connection is discovered, the interpretation of the loss will shift on its own, without effort. In a normal situation, this tool is particularly needed at the moment when you have just received bad news and your brain has already started delivering a sentence. Instead of agreeing with the first conclusion, one can pause for a moment and ask, what did I notice before this? Sometimes the answer comes immediately. Sometimes it takes a few days. But the very act of asking the question changes your position from a victim of circumstance to someone who reads the signal. Check yourself with two questions. First, is there at least one accumulated feeling that preceded this loss? Second, if you had the courage to make a decision for yourself back then, would it have looked somewhat like what happened? If the answer to both questions is yes, you already have a different picture in your hands. The next time you find yourself in a fresh loss, the first reaction will be the same. The brain will say, catastrophe. But if you ask this question even in the first days, something in the interpretation will begin to shift earlier. Not the pain will go away, but the sentence will lose its finality. The brain is very good at closing the case right away. Loss means defeat, an abrupt end means the finish. This conclusion comes automatically, even before you've had time to see what exactly has been severed and where the path has now opened. The main thing that remains after this video is not a list of rethinking, but one specific shift. The pain of loss and the meaning of loss are two different layers. The first layer is always real. The second appears later, and sometimes much later. There's no need to rush it. But there's also no need to close the case with a verdict before it appears. This is especially important at the moment when the loss is still fresh and you feel as if the ground has disappeared from beneath your feet. It's at that time that the brain is most confident in its verdict. And it's also then that it's worth remembering that the confidence of interpretation in a moment of stress is not the same as its accuracy. Look at something from your past that seemed like the worst possible outcome at the time. Most likely, there will be at least one such point. And if you honestly answer the question, what did it really open up? The answer will be more complex than just pain. This doesn't mean that any loss has a beautiful meaning, but it does mean that the automatic verdict deserves reconsideration. The next time something is severed, you will already have a question, not an answer, a question. That's enough to not close the case prematurely. If this video has shifted something in the way you view your losses, subscribe to the channel. The next episode will continue this topic from another angle.